Tom, and this is probably coming back to competitive pitching. You've covered a lot of that as well. The negotiation dynamics involved in that. Is there anything further we could add around that field of how we're dealing with competitive pitching? Is there other areas of the negotiation dynamics that we haven't covered?
Well, look, I think I mean, we've talked about the entry stages of a
Yeah.
pitch.
Mm.
The other part that causes a lot of problems is when we get to what I call the last 5 minutes
Yeah.
of a pitch. Now, it's a little bit of a truism, but procurement are trained. I'm going to use that word loosely. Procurement are trained that 80% concessions will come in the last 20% of the pitch process. Yeah. And what that's effectively saying is that, as you get closer to the end of a pitch process, I mean, let's imagine you've gone to 7 or 8 or 9 suppliers as the initial part. And let's imagine you then bring it down to either a final shortlist or an interim shortlist. So we're cutting the field maybe from 9 or 10 down to 3 or 4 or whatever, but certainly some kind of shortlist. That's the horrible point from the supplier's point of view, because that's the point where procurement are effectively sitting back at that stage, and then they're writing the emails and they're saying, we're now in the final stage of this pitch. All of the suppliers have got out to this final stages could do the work. You're all pretty much the same as far as we're concerned. Price is now the most important thing. That's pretty much the message. And this is why people hate procurement. This is now a price-based decision. You need to sharpen your pencil is kind of how it comes across. And that's where people say to me, look, we have no chance in this situation. Because all we can do is basically just keep lowering the price and hope, at that stage. And I say, well, really? I mean, surely there's got to be a better way, to protect yourselves as you go into, the closing stages of pitches. And let's maybe just unpack that a little bit,
Yep.
because there's 2 or 3 different things that you can do, I think, to protect yourself. I think the first thing is to recognize that, go back to that business requirements thing again. In the RFP document, there is a section that says business requirement that says this is how the decision will be made. Now, in most organizations, that decision process is going to be primarily a pretty logical, rational, data-driven assessment process. And typically what you're going to do, and I'm sure you've come across weighted decision matrices and that sort of thing in your time, they're very commonly used. So effectively, procurement and the internal stakeholders will take that business requirement set, they'll apply a weight to each of those business requirements. So if what's more important to us, what's least important to us. I mean, I can remember years and years ago doing these things of musts and wants and highly weighted wants, and it's all fabulous stuff. You can see it appeals to my scientific straight line thinking background. Anyway, you go through this sort of pseudo-scientific approach to decision making. You basically assess each of the suppliers against each of the business requirements. You give the suppliers a score. You multiply the score by the weights. You add up all the columns, and hey presto, you've got a list of 5 suppliers each now who have a score, and the higher the score, the better. Value, cost, cash, and risk, Peter. I'll test you on that one at the end. Remember, risk is important. So you do a risk assessment at that point, and you say, well, what are the typical risks that could be associated with this? What's the probability of the risk? High probability, what's the seriousness, all that sort of stuff. And you would essentially come up with a recommendation that says, this is the supplier from a fit to business requirements point of view. And remember, by the way, price is only one of multiple business requirements, and the weighting of price will go up and down depending on a whole bunch of factors. But what you'll end up with is some sort of scoring thing with a risk assessment, a supplier recommendation, and the internal team with procurement will make that decision. Now, you're not going to tell the suppliers that, though, are you? Because that gives the game away, and negotiation, one key part of negotiation strategy is what I call information disclosure. What's your information disclosure strategy? Because, as a negotiator, if you sit there and you don't disclose information, and neither does the other side, you're only just going to have a fight, aren't you? You're going to have a banging of heads. So this information disclosure thing is quite important for all negotiators. And from a procurement's point of view, it's certainly not in your interest to tell that preferred supplier they've won while the rest of them are still in play, while we can still apply a little bit of competitive leverage. And that's why procurement basically, in the closing stages, those last 5 minutes of a pitch, they're absolutely not going to tell you you are the preferred supplier. They're going to tell everybody, we're now into the closing stages. We now need the final bids. Let's say by Friday at 1 o'clock, I want best and final from all of you. And by the way, you're 20% more expensive than everybody else. So it's 20%.
Mm,
And you put
mm,
deadlines on, and you use those last 5 minutes of the pitch process to drive a single issue haggle on price, and it becomes a bidding war effectively. Now, from procurement's point of view, that's a highly effective strategy, a very, very effective strategy. In fact, let's be absolutely clear.
mm,
Competitive pitches, in my opinion, are not designed to be fair. Let's be absolutely clear on that.
mm,
Competitive pitches, in my opinion, are designed by, well, when they are designed by procurement, they are designed by procurement to maximize competitive leverage for as long as possible, because the
mm,
ideal competitive pitch is one where actually I don't need to do any negotiation at all, because the process does the negotiation for me. You know,
mm,
the way I've set up the process, the way I get suppliers into the process, the way I constrain them during the process, and using this pressure of the marketplace in the closing stages. Hey, what's left to negotiate? You know, well, you could say, well, the contract. Well, actually, as part of the entry to the game, I might well have given you my standard contract, and I might well have said to you up front, well, actually, if you're going to be part of this pit, you need to agree to our standard terms and conditions as one of the entry things to the game. So we
mm,
get to the end of the thing. You've already agreed the contract. Now here's the pricing. Sign on the dotted line and start on Monday. Now that's the perfect the perfect pitch from a procurement point of view. So how can you challenge that? Well, if you get your heads around, fundamentally, if you believe me, that probably 80, 90% of competitive pitches, the winner has already been decided by procurement and the internal stakeholders before you get to the last 5 minutes of the deal. The last 5 minutes of the deal then becomes simply theater. You know,
mm,
it's competitive leverage theater. And if you agree with me that that's likely to be the case, well, why would you do anything in the last
mm,
5 minutes? Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't do. You know, you might decide to do something. You might decide to make some concessions that are not necessarily price related or whatever, because you might want to show willingness or whatever. But do you actually need to do anything? Now, that's a tough call. It's a tough call from a supplier's point of view because you might have put 6 months into this
mm,
and your
mm,
team might be sitting looking at you and going, boss, are you really not going to drop the price? All the work we've put in, and you're telling me you're going to sit there and hold fast. You know, the pressure on a
mm,
business leader
mm,
is colossal. And I'm telling you something that's completely countercultural. I'm basically saying, look, the chances are, no matter what you do, you've either won it or lost it.
mm,
Now that's tough. That is very tough. But that fundamentally is what this comes down to. What else could you do? I mean, other than that, taking that tough decision, what else could you do? You could effectively say to the client, well, I'll tell you what, here's a couple of options here. And options in negotiations are generally pretty good things. People like
yeah,
choices. You could say to the client, well, look, under the circumstances you've given me, I am prepared to take another 1% off the price. If you're going to really force me into this, and everyone's effectively negotiating against themselves here, I will drop the price by another 1% just to show willing. However, if you are prepared to give me a 48-hour period of exclusivity in this negotiation, I'm going to signal to you now there is likely to be more flexibility on price, provided we could also talk about X, Y, and Z,
mm,
because X, Y, and Z are also quite important to me. So I'm effectively opening the door and saying there is more price flexibility, but I'm putting a condition on it.
mm,
Now that's going to protect you. And the reality is, if the client is going to appoint you anyway, and if the client sees the ability for more price reductions by going down that route, then why wouldn't they? And if they decide not to go down that route again, that's telling you something. You know,
exactly,
it's
exactly.
there's a whole bunch of things that people seem to think because procurement tell them to do something, they have to do it, and it's
Mm,
complete bullshit. You don't need to do anything, but there are choices and the consequences of choices. So I guess my advice would be to everyone: don't look at procurement as this all-conquering,
mm,
all-powerful function that basically drives the way we have to behave. It is complete and utter nonsense. If you if you choose to behave like a commodity, you will be treated like a
mm,
commodity.
mm,
If you choose to behave as someone who has value to bring, you will get that response, unless they were never going to appoint you anyway, in which case you've just saved yourself a whole bunch of time.
So know what you're worth, and again, have faith in your value when you go into that process. And as you mentioned,
Yeah.
by that stage, the decision's basically been made. So you fall back.
A lot of the time, yeah.
And I think that's where the emotions can come into a little, as you said, the sunk cost to go into it. You've got that impact. Then the other aspect of the emotions of people thinking, well, it's more competitive now. We're in it. We should try a little bit harder, but it's basically been done. So they're squeezing out that a little bit more in the end at the same time, which they're terrific tips as well. I think, as I said, instead of fearing procurement, it's looking at it as an opportunity to negotiate right up to the last stage of the process. And it is a social process. Everyone thinks it's just a completely transactional process, but it is a social process, and relationships come into it a big part of it, as do emotions and the psychology of it all. And I think you've covered that well, Tom.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.